Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. The topic of my presentation today will be about the enterprise security. And I will try to cover some of the questions which probably face current enterprises in terms of the modern threats. A couple of words about InfoWatch, because InfoWatch is not yet that known as my previous company, Kaspersky Lab. InfoWatch was actually a spin-off of Kaspersky Lab, which was founded in 2003, and then in 2008 it became independent. So we're now ruling off as an independent company. We operate in more than 20 countries right now, and our main focus is in the data leakage prevention space and in the space of the enterprise security as such. Because I'm going to talk more about the threats and problems than about the solutions, because it's easier. So I first start with the classification. Classification of the threats can be done differently. For example, it can be done on the perspective of different levels of the targets. It can be a person, human being as a target for the threat. It can be an enterprise, or it can even be the government. As we know, over recent years, there were viruses which were specifically targeted certain areas of other countries. The first example of such viruses was Stuxnet, which was revealed in 2009. Then we saw more examples, and we saw some of the examples of the informational attacks, but that's not the topic which we're going to talk now. We're going to talk more about the enterprise. And the enterprise is one of probably most attacked and most vulnerable in terms of different threats. So let me give another look at the categorization for the threats which can potentially be a problem for an enterprise. In terms of where the threat comes from, we can divide them into the external and internal. Like external, everything which comes from outside. It's like viruses, trojans, spam, hacker attacks, everything, right? And the internal, which comes from inside, from the company employees or from people who are working within the company. And then also to extend on, is the problem accidental? Is it happening because simply it was a case? Or was it deliberate? Was it intentional? For example, hacker attacks is always intentional because somebody wanted to get this target. When an employee made a mistake and printed a confidential document, left it in a printer, and then somebody took it off, then it's obviously accidental threats. And when we're talking about the protection, of course, we need to consider, because there are different protection for different types of the threats. Our company is working more on the internal threats, and we have been monitoring the data leakages since 2005. So we have long year statistic. Some of the statistic could probably be interesting. But before I come to that, I would like to mention, I found an interesting statistic from Verizon, how these different type of threats were migrating. And they asked for more than 200 CIOs in the companies, how do they view different type of threats over years. And in 2011, the most dominating threats was hacking. It was what the CIOs mostly faced. And in 2012, last year, it was more about social kind of intrusions, or even physical intrusions, which grew significantly, which makes an interesting transition. That if previously we have been talking about malware and hacking attacks that now is getting into some different areas. So we see the transition, and it actually getting more into the internal attacks type of threats in comparison to the external. Some of the threats are mixed, so we cannot say exactly is it external or internal. The best example is a Trojan, which comes from outside, but which is run by an employee. So when some employee just makes it released in the corporate network, would it be external? Would it be internal? Of course, it's internal. So we're talking now more about increasing number of the internal threats. And probably one of the reasons of that is that there are more or less good measures and meanings and software products which block all the type of malware, malicious things. But when we're talking about targeted attacks and when we're talking with the help of the insider, then any threat becomes much more aggressive and could have bigger consequences. So another interesting statistic which I was going to give is about the cases which we witnessed over last years. We analyze the statistic only which goes to the public. So only statistic which went into the press, into media. We don't count those cases which we see, for example, on our clients, just in order not to mix them. So last year it was about 800 cases, 800 something. This year, first half of the year was already almost 500 published cases. Altogether, it included 258 million records, because most of the data losses concerns of personal data. It's customer database in majority of cases. Interesting thing that Germany jumped up since the last year. I will show it later. And some of the interesting things that government agencies are now leading the role in terms of data losses. The reported losses altogether, only those which can be proven, exceed 3.6 billion worldwide, which is a significant amount of money. This is how number of accidents looks since 2006. We see that this year we already, the number of cases grew significantly, so we could expect that it would be about 1,000 cases altogether, or a little bit less during this year, so the number continues to grow. In terms of data leakage channel, interesting thing, which might be interesting for you, is that we sometimes think that the most important channel of information leakage can be mobile devices or email, because it's so easy to take a document and send it by email. But in the reality, the most often data leaks through PCs or notebooks, which are physically taken and brought somewhere, or through paper. Altogether, these two channels represent more than 54% of all the information leakages. Paper means we printed the documents and either left it occasionally or just brought it together with us, having this deliberate intention. If we look at terms which data leaks, is it commercial or, well, governmental, then the number of governmental data continues to grow, and this year this trend continues. It dropped significantly in 2010, probably because of crisis, and then it continues to grow. We see like waves. It was growing since 2006 and dropped and grow again. And in terms of which data leaks, majority of data which leaks is personal data, as I already mentioned. In terms of countries, of course, US dominates the statistic because of simple reason. They have the special law which prescribes companies to disclose any case of data information leakage. And therefore, it's not because they're so incredibly bad, it's because the companies report every leakage. And usually it was like US and UK at the first positions and other countries then, and now we see that Russia suddenly jumped on the second place, and Germany for previous year, I don't have the statistic, for the previous year it used to be Germany was somewhere down the list, like number 16. But of course, when I'm talking about that Germany jumped up, we need to understand that we don't consider all the statistics, we only consider the top of iceberg. Only maybe 1% of cases from the real data leakage cases. Because not, of course, 100% goes into the press, only maybe 1% is maximum. So the reality might be different. We can only analyze some trends on what we see on this particular 1%. And some of the important conclusion is that expected channel of data leakage are different than people would probably think about it. Obviously, the chief information officers or chief security officers underestimate the problem because the number of leakages continue to grow so significantly. And this worrying trend of increasing data leakages from governmental organization and from governmental secrets. So there's a basic conclusions. Then now what to do? Of course, when we're talking about information security and the security in organization, there are basically 3 things to be done. Is number 1 is the organizational measures. Number 2 is the model of the threats, which we will fight. And based on these 2, we choose the technical solutions. Because I represent a vendor, so for me it's much easier to speak about technical solutions. The technical solutions basically can be divided also from different type. It will look at the tasks of the technical solution. So it can be divided for infrastructural protection, something which protects infrastructure, like firewall, like antivirus, which protects PCs or network or servers or mobile devices, is all infrastructural protection, in my opinion. Content analysis is something which look inside of the documents and try to analyze which documents must be blocked by whatever reason. It might be a reason of we don't want spam, then it will be an anti-spam filter, or it might be a reason we don't want confidential information to leak, then it will be data leakage prevention measures. And then a separated task which we cannot apply to first 2 groups is an encryption. When we encrypt our documents and hope they will not escape because of this encryption. I will look from another perspective in terms of threats. I spoke about internal and external threats, and we tried to divide the solutions in terms of protection for internal threats. There are certain measures which only oriented on the internal threats, like access control, for example, data right management. It only speaks about something which prevents employees to get some information, or system which monitors the internal security, like CIM, DLP also, partially endpoint security, because some functionality in the endpoint security oriented on the internal threats. And there are some measures which are oriented on the external threats. Interestingly enough, we already see that some of these technical solutions start to measure, like endpoint security is a good example. Is a new category, basically, which was announced, I think, 3-4 years ago by Gartner and IDC, and which includes the protection for the ports, for USBs, and on one side, and antivirus on the another side altogether, and they call it endpoint security, like a separated group. And that's why it creates some problems, because it now tries to fight both type of threats, and we cannot say it does it perfectly. What problems, if in general, it's very difficult to speak in general, but if we try to speak in general, what problems all these technical solutions have? First of all, there are some very much integrated solutions, like, for example, Symantec or McAfee are those vendors who are leading these integrated solutions in this space. They say, we have security from one pocket. You may protect everything by our solutions. Good, but the problem is that if you use a solution from one vendor, first of all, it's easier to break in when you know which solution is used. And second, some of the functionality cannot be perfect. The other approach is when CIO just pick up the best solutions, best of breed solutions in the market and try to integrate it together. But then it's much harder to manage. It creates certain problems in the implementation and management. So, but maybe in terms of security, it could be a better approach. So none of the approaches is just simple and easy and works well. Second problem of all those solutions, that they analyze threats. As I showed before, they either oriented on the threats or they oriented on certain protection of certain things, like infrastructure, for example. They don't analyze human. But if we think, who is actually the problem? Is always a human. It's humans who are writing viruses, there are humans who are putting the Trojans in the network, there's humans who are stealing or losing documents, there are always humans, and humans are out of this analysis. The third problem is that solution normally focused on a particular threats. We see some integrated stuff, but still they're very much oriented on some particular threats. Like, for example, antivirus is something which works against viruses. Well, but how to be if some Trojan is trying to steal the confidential document and send it out? It's something mixed, so many of the threats are mixed. And this is another problem. And the last but not least, that existing measures don't give any guarantee. Of course, the last problem is not possible to solve because nobody never gives you a guarantee. It always will be something which missed. And of course, being in the security for so many years, I understand that we can only get closer, and we always fight or watch this fight against the protection and the bad guys which are improving themselves in creating the threats. But still, it is a problem, and still we see that, unfortunately, the threats are evolving faster than the protection. One thing which was going to beautifully show is that human is in the center of all the threats. And how do I see the horizons? What, in my opinion, would happen in the security, in IT security field for the enterprise protection? Of course, it's very difficult to give any predictions, and I cannot bet that predictions would be happening. But the first trend which we see is more and more companies now try to analyze human behavior and make some predictions based on human behavior. For example, there are some tools which try to create a profile of a particular employee, and if an employee behavior is very much lies outside of this profile, then it might look suspicious, and then we can do some steps or something, maybe trying to speak to this employee or trying to analyze what's wrong, or maybe put some more cameras around him, I don't know. So something which would be oriented not on the threats itself. The second trend which we witness is because the threats are mixing, there must be the solution which analyze threats on different angles. Many people now, you know, there's a very fashion topic, big data. Many people speak about big data, and I'm certain that big data is now coming into the enterprise security when different data from different sources will be analyzed and some conclusions will be done based on this big data analysis. Another thing which has been developing, but we yet have not seen any realization, was risk analysis. Many companies claim they may have risk analysis. Unfortunately, the problem here that they can claim it, but they cannot really predict the risks. But I still believe there must be some steps done in terms of risks elimination when we analyze the risks and can do some steps which foresee the problem before the problem occurs. Certainly is one of the areas where the security measures will come. And then you were talking about the different size of enterprise, then we see an obvious trend that enterprise prefer to choose different solutions to pick up the best and build up their own security field in the organization. And SMB prefer all-in-one product, which they believe might be sufficient for their needs. Of course, here we speak about the balance, how much money and how much resources I'm going to spend, and because small, medium companies don't have such, well, budgets like big organizations, they prefer simple and easy way. One more thing which is left is about how to be about privacy, because the first item I mentioned is that human being would be probably in the center of security analysis. There is a Germany's federal law, so-called Bundesdatenschutzgesetz, which says that actually personal information, there is a way on how corporations should look into the employees' data or employees' documentation, email, etc. But it must take some steps. First step must be that this look-through documentations must be permitted by the employee, normally in a written way, that the employees sign up some documents. Yes, I agree that my, well, whatever email and the channel of my information will be looked by the employer. Second, this permission must exactly specify the means which would be used for such search, and the organization must have certain policies, procedures, and controls in place. And these procedures and policies exactly described in this law. So basically, the conclusion which I must give is that the protection can be provided, because it's always a question I'm asked, how about the privacy? And wouldn't we violate the privacy if we try to protect the organization? Or we try to protect customer information, but then we violate the privacy of employees. So the problem can be solved quite easy. Well, that's all what I'm going to say. And if you have questions, then please.